I think it's Chapter 1 in the Language Rights and Law in the United States. The value of this chapter is to give you a little background. No memorization here, okay? What can you draw from this after you kind of go through it and read some of the examples? You'll see that the United States started out relatively positive in terms of, it talks about Thomas Jefferson attitudes. In Ohio and Pennsylvania, there were large German populations. The laws of the state were published in German and in English because the United States was a very multicultural society. You also have to take into account that the Germans were seen as people similar to the English. You know, they both have a kind of roughly a Germanic language. English is a Germanic language. And so initially, diversity was tolerated in language in terms of schools, newspapers. It wasn't seen as a threat because the outside threat was actually the British. So it wasn't an issue. The Germans were seen as allies against the British. And so people encouraged them to keep their language and to be loyal, patriotic citizens. You can see this carried through really until the 1850s. But that was unique for Pennsylvania and Ohio. A lot of the early, especially in Ohio, there were a lot of beer brewers active there. It's kind of a sideline, but you might have you've heard of the Bushes in St. Louis, Missouri, German brewers that came over. So beer was very popular in early America. That's why we had things like beer gardens and stuff. So culturally, the Germans were very much a fit. And so there really wasn't a lot of discrimination there. People weren't too concerned about it. Now, California, the examples they give, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and then they talk about California. California, and they talked to Californios, the people that were Hispanic that were in California. They pretty much were not bothered, but they had very loose government. Mexico did not have strong control of California. But it wasn't until 1846. And at first, the people that were in California when the United States received it or took it from Mexico, that huge swath of area, they were allowed in as citizens. And for some time, Spanish was tolerated. But immediately when the Yankees, or as they call the whites, came into California, especially with the gold rush in 1849, the linguistics rights started to go down the tubes. You could see the shift. And it's easy to see why that would happen, because there was a desire to have the language of Washington, D.C., of the United States, asserting its, what you may have heard the term manifest destiny, the belief that the United States should, it actually extended all the way from going to Cuba to going all the way to the Pacific and going north towards Canada. And it was a belief in the inevitability of America to expand. That was a very nationalistic and patriotic theory or belief system that caused a lot of the aggression, taking other territory. They give some examples in here to talk about. And last official edition of California Laws in Spanish were published in 1878. And then it turned toward English only, because with the widespread expansion of schools, universities, it was realized that language, in order to have a consistent language, and because the whites and others, everyone should learn English and they shouldn't have Spanish. So there was a great deal of intolerance. And so California fell under that. New Mexico, in a very similar way, was under Spanish domination for a very long time. But when it came time for New Mexico to become a state in the Union, there was a lot of resistance. in fact, this one chapter in 15, I was going to read this to you because you almost say, is that not something you've heard lately? A Republican senator from Indiana, Albert Jeremiah Beveridge, chaired these hearings about letting New Mexico become a state. And he was appalled at the Spanish character of the area. To gather evidence in opposition to the statehood for this state, he attached to the record exhibits of legal notices in English and Spanish, and hearings lists of criminal indictments showing the preponderance of Spanish surnames. His contention was simple. New Mexico was an area populated by Spanish-speaking criminals, and as such could not be fit for statehood. So you see a prejudice because of language. People are accused of being criminals. So then we have, and that's in early 20th century. Eventually, New Mexico did get statehood, but there was a lot of resistance, and then it went on to teaching of English there. Another example, if you've heard of the Cajun people of Louisiana, it was a French-speaking place for a very long time. And briefly after the Civil War, there was a real crackdown on the speaking of French in Louisiana. That's because Union troops occupied the South. Now, a few years afterward, they were given a little bit of leeway, but you have to realize there are a large number of people in Louisiana, their first language is Cajun, a variation of French. And again, the desire to make uniformity across the United States, to be patriotic, was to make sure English again was the dominant language. And then we've got Puerto Rico, which was acquired in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. So the United States kept Puerto Rico as a territory. And it's a commonwealth now. So it's not a state. They are citizens, by the way, but it's not a state. And there was a great deal of, and there's a lot of capitalism going on here. Capitalism in the sense that big companies knocked out small companies, especially native-born companies. Little pause there. Puerto Rico was a poor country under the Spain and a poor country under the United States for a very long time. And they even, I think the most interesting, Puerto Rico is spelled P-U-E-R-T-O, Puerto Rico. But some people for a while, try to change the spelling to P-O-R-T-O, Puerto Rico, so English speakers could say the name more easily. In 1899, another quote, and this is, usually you're going to see Spanish is the language under attack. We know the Native Americans were literally beaten out of their language and sent to Indian schools. But Dr. Victor Clark, the president of the Insular Board of Education, wrote in 1899, the important fact that must not be overlooked is that a majority of people of this island do not speak pure Spanish. If you ever studied Spanish or know something about variations in Spanish, you know this is true. Every part, Mexico, Peru, Argentina, Spain, they all have their variations in Spanish. He said they do not speak pure Spanish. Their language is patois, I guess, almost unintelligible to the natives of Barcelona and Madrid. It possesses no literature and little value as an intellectual medium. This is a lot like the way they treat Native American languages. They didn't have literature. Well, of course, they didn't have books, Native Americans, but Puerto Rico still read Spanish literature. And he said, basically, culturally, they do not have anything to offer. Their language is not even pure Spanish. It's not even a decent foreign language or elegant. So I call this, very patronizing to say that the language of individuals is unacceptable because it's not pure enough. You'll find this out in the world of Spain, Spanish language, world of French. I'm sure it exists in other countries, Chinese, Russian. There's the superior language, and then there's the other ones that are considered inferior. So this attitude, of course, feeling English is superior, that even said that Spanish didn't even count. So you see in this chapter that language rights are gradually being ground away as the United States becomes a more dominant power and a more powerful country and a more centralized government, is we need to get rid of all these people that don't fit in. We need to get rid of the people that speak the wrong language. We need to get German out. And you'll see in the rest of the chapter, Puerto Rico obviously has had a real struggle to maintain their language. And the Constitution was not brought to bear on much of this, certainly not until after the Civil War, and then it was the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Amendment, which basically was an attempt to, you should not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process, okay? And that was originally passed with the idea of freed blacks not being denied the right to vote and their freedom. It was basically saying in the 14th Amendment that the rest of the Constitution applies to minorities or to all of us. But the intent after the Civil War was mainly for that constitutional amendment to protect African Americans. But it gradually becomes used as due process. This is still being battled over today. And so they called it the equal protection. Do they have equal protection? A number of cases here. One in California, they had Yik-Wo versus Hopkins. And I forget the date of this. I know it was in California. They wanted to close down laundries run by Chinese. And they only enforced the law on Chinese, but not on white-owned laundries, which obviously was discriminatory. And in that case, in 1880, that Supreme Court said that was violation of the due process, which is the 14th Amendment. But this did not always win, but I mean, at least it was provided a basis. They talk about this law and the idea that there has to be strict scrutiny to see whether or not there's a definite unfair preference given to one group over another when the groups are not really different. You know, if you owned a laundry in California, you shouldn't have to worry about if you're only Chinese and you own the laundry, you get punished. And if they don't apply the law fairly to the other group, then it's unequal. This is still completely a big issue. And the Supreme Court made some rather enlightening arguments there, due process clause. But what was really interesting, and this is in Nebraska, is until they actually took it off the books just a few years ago, there was a law in the books in Nebraska that you could not teach a foreign language. And it was used specifically that Germans could not teach Germans, even in parochial schools, to children under in 8th grade or below. And this was an answer to World War I, when there was a lot of anti-German discrimination, because we were at war with Germany. People became very suspicious of the Germans. And previously they had been accepted in Ohio, St. Louis, and Pennsylvania, the Dutch Germans. And so people turned against Germans because it was even said that German language is not consistent with democracy, even though it had a great philosophy and engineering and all kinds of powerful advances in civilization philosophy. So in the United States, this was a law that for a while was applied. Eventually, Supreme Court muted this, or said you cannot enforce it, but it didn't come off the books until Nebraska did that a few years ago. We actually voted on that. I think it was probably 20 years ago when I first arrived in Nebraska. I remember this. But the point is, it was a crime to teach German. And you have probably heard about the English as an official language, which is really what they're kind of talking about here, is the idea over time that English has been seen as the way to unify the country, and that if you did not teach English, then you were unpatriotic. That's my take on it. So that was something that took place in Nebraska, and that statute was that law against Meyer was overturned, but the law itself didn't come off the books. Some other examples. The Philippine government was under American control, and thus the laws of the United States, because we took over the Philippines, just like Puerto Rico, after the Spanish-American War in 1898. And there was a restriction of laws passed by the Philippine government that said the Chinese could not keep a set of accountant books in the Chinese language. Okay? Specifically, many Chinese were engaged in being accountants, but they kept books in the Philippine language or in English, but they also kept a set of books in Chinese. And they actually passed a law saying it's illegal for businessmen to keep their books in Chinese. Literally, you can't have those books. When I'm saying books, I'm talking about accounting books. And so it's on page 39, Yu Kong Ing versus Trinidad. And that again was overturned because it was enforced against the Chinese. It's very important to realize that not only was there discrimination against Spanish for many, many years, and the Germans eventually, but Chinese, Japanese, and Asian languages and Asian people were the subject of terrible discrimination beginning in probably the 1850s. If you didn't know, the many Chinese, some Japanese, but many Chinese came to the United States to build the railroads. When you always hear people talking about building the railroads were not built by white frontier people. They might have been the engineers, they might have been the supervisors, but many of the laborers, because it was horrible labor. I mean, you're on the frontier. It's dangerous, it's bad water, there's lack of food, it's hard job, but it was good money for many Chinese laborers. They actually built the Union Pacific. It goes right through Nebraska, goes went all the way to Lincoln. I think it was from Nebraska to San Francisco, was built in 1867, I think, is when they put in the Golden Spike in Ogden, Utah, or maybe it was Provo. But there was real anti-Asian discrimination. And people spoke of it, and the term used, if you're not familiar with it, was called the Yellow Peril. Okay, the Germans, I forget what they may call the Kaiser, or the Huns, they were called after the group that invaded Europe at the fall of the Roman Empire. The Hungarians, or Hungs, they were associated with the Germans, and the Yellow Peril was associated with Asians because of the foolish idea that their skin tone was yellow. I mean, it was just simply a way to stereotype people. Okay, but it wasn't just the Chinese launderers or the accountants in the Philippines. Also, in Hawaii, there was a lot of concern about people teaching Chinese in Hawaii because there were a lot of Chinese people there, even Japanese, I think, to some extent. And there were acts of law in Hawaii to try to suppress the teaching of Asian languages. You'll remember that Hawaii was an independent country that was seized by the United States, and you have to look up the dates, but it was late 19th century. And so the fact is that it was seen that in order for it to be part of America, just like in Puerto Rico, there's a lot of pressure. You've got to teach English, and we're not going to allow them to teach Japanese or Chinese or any of those languages. Now, what I want you to come away with, and you'll remember this led up to the internment of Japanese-Americans, not Japanese, but Japanese-American citizens were actually put in camps. You can call them concentration camps. They weren't built to murder people, but they were built and caused people to lose their homes. They lost their property, they lost money, and they were stuck in camps in the middle of nowhere. You may have to do a little bit of reading on that, but why is this chapter important? This chapter is important because it shows that the tendency in American history as we have come to the present is, except for the rule of law, which has mitigated some of this, the tendency's been to suppress and eliminate those that are different or languages that are different. So you won't, if you're an advocate for ESL kids, you're not going to be citing cases and trying to convince people with this, because, and it's sad, but people unfortunately are not apparently very cognizant of history or very interested in whether or not your argument based on history is going to be persuasive. They don't seem to care. But this chapter is important because language rights are still up in the air. This is still a controversy. We have, I think I mentioned it in one of my little videos, but I mentioned it that Arizona passed a law to end the teaching of Mexican studies. They weren't going after the language, but they were going after the idea that if you study Mexican culture, that you are not helping create the great American nation. This is recent, by the way. The same thing, putting an end to a big one, a huge one. And although I don't talk about bilingual education, there are dual language programs in Lexington at one elementary school where Spanish and English are taught. And I think in Omaha, there's a dual language program. But having this knowledge that what's happening right now is rooted in a history of opposing what you might call foreign language, although I can make the argument Spanish is the first European language in the Americas. If you know history, you know that when the Pilgrims landed, the Spanish Empire had universities in the Americas, while the Pilgrims are trying to keep from starving to death in the middle of winter. So if we talk about civilization, then the idea is somehow one language is superior to another is a misnomer. So that's from this book, Language Rights. I want you to read, have at least some of this in your mind, because you need to realize that language issues have been here from very early on in American history. Very detrimental to native languages. At first, very tolerant of more European languages, but I'm sure Dutch was spoken in New York because, New York was a Dutch colony, part of it, New Amsterdam. And of course, the English wanted the Dutch out, so they wanted English taught. So the fear of suspicion of people that speak differently than you has been there forever, okay? Usually business doesn't worry about it too much, and literature doesn't. But when it comes to politics, other languages are seen very negatively. This isn't just an American thing. It's in every country that's had an empire. The Romans wanted people to learn Latin, so they conquered a place, they would take hostages of some of the high elite people in whatever colony or whatever nation. And those guys would go into Rome and learn to speak Latin and be cultured like a Roman because they wanted them to pick up their Roman ways. I'm sure the Incas did the same thing with other tribes in Central America or South America. They wanted people to be Incas. And the Aztecs probably, I mean, I don't think the Aztecs, I think they chopped their heads off. That was about it. So that's what I want you to remember from this little chapter. I do this because I just want to highlight a couple of things. All right, I'm going to try to do one more, and then that'll be usually my talk for the week.